Salutations everyone, today is January the 6th, also known as the King's Day. Known by who? By myself. There is actually nobody who calls it King's Day. It is still a fitting name. Today in 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. In 1205, Philip of Swabia was crowned King of the Romans. In 1322, Stephen Euros III was crowned King of Serbia. In 1355, Charles IV was crowned King of Italy. And why not, in 1449, Constantine XI was crowned the Byzantine Emperor. So, since we're talking about kings and emperors, today we're going to go and take a look at our update on the kings of Mythic Plus. We have looked at this last time about 9-10 days ago during our start of the Fortified week. So today we are giving our update on Mythic Plus about last week's on Fortified and the first few days of this week on Tyrannical. Forgive me if today you don't have a camera to admire my beautiful features, however, I am currently afflicted by a quite painful dental cavity, which is forcing me to hold my left side of the face, actually, and fill myself up with painkillers. So, you will appreciate my stoic sacrifice of still making videos despite being quite in pain at the moment. That being said, we are looking at Mythic Plus, we are comparing it what we saw in the last few weeks of the start of this season. So we are going to skip rather quickly past the popularity and the play rate of the specs in all key levels, because the popularity of these specs has remained more or less the same if we have to look at all key levels. What is cool is that after we looked at this, now we are starting to get into a deep enough level in the season where we can start taking a look at keys at or above level 20. So we are breaking the barrier of the Keystone Hero, the plus 20 level. That is where we will, of course, inevitably start seeing way more disparity between specs, way more specs in the 1 or 2% play rate, with many others in the 20, 30 or even 40% play rate, because that's what happens when you start getting into very, very high keys. So starting as usual with the tanks, this was the plus 15 range of last week. This was just basically at the start of the very easy Fortified week of last week, and this is right at the beginning of the Tyrannical week of this week. And you can see that Protection Warrior is growing even larger compared to last time. It has grown by quite a bit, almost 30% increase. You also have an increase, much smaller of course, of Blood Death Knight, while most of the other tanks as a result went down by quite a bit, pretty much all of them. After the tanks with the continued growth of Protection Warrior, for which, by the way, I will continue to blame all of the players, the content creators, and some of the personalities who went on Twitter trying to influence Blizzard about the too heavy nerfs given to Protection Warrior being too mean and that Blizzard should have done something about it. Eventually those nerfs were reverted, and this is where we are right now. This is all your fault. Talking about healers, the situation is not nearly as depressing, mostly because there is at the very least a couple of them, if even 3 of them, being quite nice. In the plus 15 range, this was the situation, and in the plus 20 range, we see more or less the same thing, but the numbers, as mentioned, are still somewhat okay. Restoration Druid is quite the popular pick, followed right after by Preservation Evoker. There is still a decent representation of Holy Priest, and not even that bad of a representation of Holy Paladin either. So it is true, Discipline, Mistweaver and Restore Shaman have much worse numbers than the representation of the tanks, but at least you have 4 different specs for healers not being that terrible. I think overall it's a better situation than where the tanks are right now. Much like Protection Warrior, it is still quite unexplainable why did Restoration Druid get buffed by 5% to all of their healing just a week or so ago. That was quite confusing given their current power in Mythic Plus. That was kind of weird. Then we have the melee DPS. So jumping from 15 keys to 20 keys, where's the difference? The difference is that there is an even more prevalence of Outlaw Rogue, which has a significant jump in popularity. Many of the other specs as a result shrink a little bit more. You see that, for example, Fury Warrior goes down quite a bit, by almost 30%. You see that other specs, Windwalker Monk drops by very little. The only surprising change, actually, if you notice this from these numbers, is that Enhancement Shaman is growing. That is not what you would expect if you see Enhancement being the fifth, I believe, the fifth most played spec in plus 15s. You don't expect them to grow once you go into plus 20. You expect the 4 specs ahead of Enhancement to grow. Fury, Windwalker, Havoc, and Outlaw. Instead, Enhancement as well is growing in the very high level of keys. And we will see in a bit if that is correlated to what's going on in the very high keys. Lastly, we have the ranged DPS. So ranged DPS do also have something very similar. We do still see Marksmanship and Arcane and Demonology as the 3 main choices of your ranged options when you go into key levels. Even if you jump from plus 15s to plus 20s, that stays the same. In a very similar note to the growth of Enhancement, even when Enhancement wasn't one of the better picks, we have the growth of Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid, also being below the 3 top specs we just mentioned, is also growing in plus 20 keys this week. It is the only one, actually, the only spec outside of the top 2, Demo and Arcane, who actually grows, going into plus 20s. Talking about the growth, as we mentioned, of Balance, this is the spec success chance in a key. TLDR, how likely you are to complete a key with this spec in your group. This was last week in Fortified, the easiest week of Fortified we will have this season, and this currently are the first, 3 days of Tyrannical week. We can see that the easiest jump you can find when it comes to specs and their chance to complete a key in Tyrannical is of Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid last week was middle of the pack, and now they are currently the best spec at completing Tyrannical keys with 72.6% chances to complete a key. There are a handful of other changes. As you can see here, the differences between the specs is still quite interesting how, for example, last week somehow we had Fire Mage very high compared to Arcane. Now Arcane has taken back their position as the better of the range specs. Also, surprisingly, I bet you are surprised, there is a random Destruction Warlock in the top 4 this week, as opposed to last week, which was bottom 5. They jump something like 25 positions from one Fortified week to one Tyrannical week. Of course, the representation, as you can see by the amount of runs, is much tinier. There is 14,000 Havoc runs, 12,000 Marksmanship, 14,000 Outlaw, and then just 865 Destruction Warlock runs. Still, though, it's doing quite well. What is also interesting talking about the specs is the most popular compositions. TLDR, what are the chances you will find yourself in a particular group most of the time? We can see last week we checked this and we pointed out how, once again, all of the top 12 compositions were dominated by Protection Warrior. We also pointed out how previously it was 6 Preservation Evokers and 6 Restoration Druids. Then it shrunk down to 4 Preservation Evokers and 8 Restoration Druids. This week, Restoration Druids take even one extra spot. Now it's 9 Restoration Druids and just 3 Preservation Evokers, and they also take the first spot. What was also interesting last week is that we got 2 new entries. 2 Arcane Mages suddenly made it into the most popular comps. This week, we have a change. This week, we have 2 Enhancement Shamans making it into the top comps in Mythic Plus at high keys, which is in line with what we mentioned about Enhancement, despite not being very popular in plus 15s, actually growing in plus 20s in terms of representation. And here we see them in 2 of the more used, in 2 of the more seen compositions in Mythic Plus. Most of the other stuff doesn't change. Outlaw, Havoc, and Windwalker remain the 3 more popular melee picks, as well as Demonology and Marksmanship remaining the 2 more popular ranged DPS picks. Then we can also look at the difficulty of the dungeons, because this was the first time we checked, and of course there was a massive difference in the difficulty of the dungeons. You can see that after the 64% success rate of Algetar, the success chance dropped tremendously down to 37 of Nokud Offensive, and then you had all of the other dungeons below 37%, which is very low. The second week, things started getting a little bit better. As you can see here, things are now much more smooth. It's 92, 73, 63, 63, 63, 57, 56, and 46. So it's much more even and average. This was last week's on Fortified. This week, in the first few days of Tyrannical, things get even better, because now the worst dungeon is still Azure Vault, but it's not worst by that much. Now we have all dungeons above a 50% chance to complete. 51% is the lowest one of Azure Vault. Of course, there is no surprise that Shadow Moon, Burial Grounds and Court of Stars remain the two easiest dungeons this week. And also, no surprise, we are continuing to have a higher and higher success chance, both because we are getting more gear, more item level, more power, more tier sets, but also because, of course, we have just gotten a whole round of hotfix nerfs to pretty much most of the dungeon bosses happening just a few days ago. What we can do, however, is congratulate a particular dungeon, because last week we also looked at the easiest dungeons recorded in the past, I believe, 4 different seasons, and this was the result. We had the Fortified week of Shadow Moon Burial Grounds ending up being the second ever easiest key. So we have a new entry. Now the Fortified week of Shadow Moon Burial Grounds at second place has been replaced by the new Fortified week of Shadow Moon Burial Grounds with Sanguine and Volcanic, currently sitting at the easiest of keys. Passing Junkyard, Shadow Moon is currently sitting at 97.64% chance. Of course, no surprise, it's the only dungeon of Dragonflight. All the other dungeons are from previous seasons of Shadowlands. We can finish with a question. Because I heard it being put forward by some people, which is, what's harder, Fortified or Tyrannical? You actually do hear this quite often. Some players are convinced Tyrannical is easier than Fortified. Other players are convinced Fortified is actually easier than Tyrannical. So what we can do, rather than using opinions and Feelycraft, we can just look at stats. What are the numbers telling us? The numbers are telling us that Fortified is easier than Tyrannical. These are the numbers. This is the average success rate of keys, and both of the Fortified weeks we had so far have been easier at the moment than both of the Tyrannical weeks we had so far in Dragonflight. Some people might say, well, that's because one week was earlier than the other, we had less gear, we knew less about the dungeons, so the more we learn, the better we do. As you can see, even this week's Tyrannical post nerfs with much more gear than literally the first ever week of the season in Fortified, Raging and Quaking, it's still harder. It still has a less chance of success compared to the first week of the season. So at the moment we have a quite definitive judgment on which of the two weekly affixes is considered the easier one for the player base right now. With this barrage, with this flurry of data and numbers, this was the overview of this week's Mythic Plus. We will see how things progress in this week, and as we continue getting closer to patch 10.0.5, which, as a reminder, will bring even more changes to some of the classes and specs. So for now, we can just stay in the back and observe what continues changing in Mythic Plus. With this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Friday and the beginning, according to some, of your weekend. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and for supporting the channel and myself as well. You can still support in many other ways that don't include having to spend cash. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are plenty enough ways to show your support. You can still support by following me over at Twitter. That would also help quite a lot. Also, if you want to get notified on whenever I go live on stream, that is always the better way to get notified. And talking about streaming, when I do stream, I'm gonna be streaming on Twitch starting from roughly 10 PM Central European Time, 1 PM Pacific and 4 PM Eastern US time zones. So whenever you want to pop by and learn from the best on how to deplete Mythic Plus keys properly, you can come in and join the stream. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, the pain of this tooth, and we have a holiday over here, so The dentist isn't open until like Monday. Ah.